This is Russell Copeland, former NFL player for the Buffalo Bills, Green Bay Packers, and Philadelphia Eagles. Played in Super Bowl 28 as a member of the Buffalo Bills. As millions of us celebrate Black History Month, it is only fitting for Super Bowl 57 to be a historical Super Bowl because it will feature for the first time in the history of the National Football League, two African American quarterbacks will be facing off against one another. Patrick Mahomes will be facing off against Jalen Hurts. I'm going to do a part one and a part two. This is part one, and I'm going to talk about the journey, the evolution, the perseverance, and determination of the African American quarterback who faced racism in America, systemic racism in the National Football League, false narratives about his intelligence, his intellect, lied to about his talent, saying that his talent would be better utilized if he played another position, such as wide receiver, running back, or defensive back. Misconceptions about his leadership, questions about his leadership. I'm going to list all of the African American quarterbacks who helped pave the way for this historical Super Bowl that's going to be played this upcoming Sunday, Super Bowl 57. And I'm going to start in the early 1920s, and I'm going to end part one in the early 1990s. And starting in 1923, halfback signal caller Fritz Pollard becomes the first African-American quarterback in the National Football League. He played the position and took direct snaps from behind the center for the Hammond Pros in a couple of games. Nearly 20 years later, former Syracuse University quarterback Bernie Custis is the first professional black quarterback since Pollard. He signs a contract and plays for the Hamilton Tiger Cats of the Big Four League, which is a predecessor for the Canadian Football League, the CFL. 30 years later, he's inducted into the Canadian Football Hall of Fame as a running back. In 1953, 7 years after Kenny Washington and Woody Strode broke the modern color barrier in football, backup Chicago Bears quarterback Willie Thrower would become the first African-American quarterback to solely play quarterback in a National Football League game. He came in and replaced George Blanda. He would later in the football game drive the football team down to the 5-yard line where George Blanda would be reinserted. Thrower would never appear in another National Football League game. In 1955, Charlie Choo Choo Brackens becomes the fourth black quarterback to play in a National Football League game when he played in the closing minutes for the Green Bay Packers, who was up 41-10 against Cleveland. Later on in that year, he would be released and would never play in another NFL game. In 1960, Sandy Stevens leads the University of Minnesota to a national championship in the Rose Bowl. He scores 2 touchdowns. Stevens becomes the first African-American major college All-American quarterback, and he would finish 4th in the Heisman Trophy balloting. 1968, Tennessee State standout quarterback Eldridge Dickey is drafted by the Oakland Raiders in the first round, being the 25th pick. He would become the first African-American quarterback drafted in the first round by the AFL or the NFL. But he was told that he would not be able to play the quarterback position. He would have to move to wide receiver. Ken Stabler, who was the second-round draft pick out of the University of Alabama, would be the starting quarterback. Eldridge Dickey was more than capable of being the starting quarterback for the Oakland Raiders, but he did not get the opportunity to compete against Ken Stabler. Ken Stabler would go on in 1974 to lead the Oakland Raiders to their first Super Bowl championship. 1968, the same year, Marlon Briscoe was drafted in the 14th round by the AFL Denver Broncos. He would later on get his opportunity to play the third game of the season. The football team was down 20-7. He became the first African-American quarterback to be able to come into a game, lead that football team, and become the first African-American quarterback actually to start. However, Lou Saban was very reluctant to start him. And at the end of the season, he had a tremendous year, had 1,589 yards. He had 14 touchdowns and 308 yards rushing. And his 14 touchdowns for a first-year player is still near the top for the Denver Broncos record books. In 1969, James Harris is the first black quarterback to be named a team starter for the first game of the season for the Buffalo Bills. He played in a few games. In 1970, University of Toledo, Ohio quarterback Chuck Ealy. From 1969 to 1970, he goes 35-0, finishes 8th in the Heisman Trophy balloting. His NCAA record for a winning percentage is still near the top of the NCAA record book in 2007. Unfortunately for Ealy, he was overlooked by the National Football League and went undrafted in the 1972 draft. In 1974, Joe Gilliam, an 11th-round draft pick by the Steelers, ends up starting for the Pittsburgh Steelers in the 1972 season. That's also the season where there was a strike, and Terry Bradshaw was one of those players who was on strike. He was on strike for a week, and he comes to camp and he battles against Joe Gilliam. Joe Gilliam was the better quarterback, and he beat out Terry Bradshaw. He leads the football team to a 4-1-1 record. But the city of Pittsburgh was not ready for Joe Gilliam, an African-American quarterback, to lead their football team. They wanted a white quarterback to lead their football team, and it was Terry Bradshaw. Joe Gilliam received death threats. So ultimately, he was benched. Terry Bradshaw replaced Joe Gilliam and led the Pittsburgh Steelers in 1974 to a Super Bowl victory, to an NFL championship. In 1974, James Harris is the starting quarterback for the LA Rams, and he is the first African-American quarterback to start in an NFL playoff game, leading the Rams to an NFC championship game, losing to the Minnesota Vikings. But he's the first African-American quarterback that will be named to the Pro Bowl, and in that Pro Bowl game, he was the MVP. In 1978, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers draft Doug Williams out of Grambling. Doug Williams was an NCAA record-breaking quarterback, finishing in 1977 with an NCAA record of 93 touchdowns and threw for over 8,000 yards, to be exact, 8,411 yards. It would only take Doug Williams a couple of years to become one of the best quarterbacks in the National Football League. In 1980, he was emerging as one of the top quarterbacks in the NFL. In 1984, the Houston Oilers decide to sign Warren Moon to a free agent contract of $1 million. Moon would go undrafted in 1978 NFL draft after having a spectacular college career for the Washington Huskies. He would go on to play and sign in the CFL for the Edmonton Eskimos. He led the Eskimos to 5 Grey Cups. In only 6 years, Warren Moon passed for 21,228 yards and 144 touchdowns in just 6 seasons in the National Football League. In 1987, it was a strike season, and a lot of African-American quarterbacks were called to play in the National Football League in replacement duties. Several of those players were played. One of those players happened to be Vince Evans. He played college for USC, played for the Raiders in that 87 season, and Willie Totten from Mississippi Valley State played for the Buffalo Bills in 1987. Willie Totten is the quarterback that broke numerous records, throwing to the great Hall of Famer, the best wide receiver to play in the National Football League, Jerry Rice. In 1988, Doug Williams would sign a free agent contract to be a backup for the Washington Redskins, which is now the Washington Commanders. Even though in the locker room, many thought that Doug Williams should have been the starting quarterback. Doug Williams would get his opportunity to be the starting quarterback for the Washington Redskins. He would be named the signal caller, the starter in the playoffs. In the playoffs, they would go on to beat the Chicago Bears and the Minnesota Vikings. He would be named the starting quarterback to play against the Denver Broncos and John Elway in Super Bowl 22. He received numerous death threats, all type of hate mail. But he would start that football game. He would start in Super Bowl 22. And early in the first quarter, Doug Williams would get injured. They would fall behind 10-0 to John Elway and the Denver Broncos. He would be able to limp back out on a bad knee. And in the second quarter, Doug Williams will have the best second quarter in the history of the National Football League, throwing for 228 yards, 4 touchdowns. And he will end that game with a Super Bowl record of 340 yards and 4 touchdowns, beating John Elway and the Denver Broncos 42-10. On that day, Doug Williams was a better quarterback. He was better than John Elway. 1989, a major breakthrough in college football as Andre Ware from the Houston Cougars becomes the first African-American quarterback player, the quarterback position, to play the quarterback position to win the Heisman Trophy winner. And that year, he broke numerous NCAA records in passing, throwing for 4,699 yards, 46 touchdowns, leading the Cougars to 9-2. In 1990, in the National Football League, Randall Cunningham is on the scene. He leads the Philadelphia Eagles to the playoffs. He has an MVP caliber type of year, running for 942 yards and 5 touchdowns, throwing for 3,466 yards and passing for 30 touchdowns, which goes to his 3rd straight Pro Bowl. But he was not named the MVP. As a matter of fact, for 4 times, he finished 2nd in the MVP balloting. Wow, that's amazing. He snubbed 4 times. Randall Cunningham putting up these type of numbers is snubbed 4 times. Now I'm going to end in 1993. In 1993, Florida State quarterback Charlie Ward is named the 1993 winner of the Heisman Trophy and wins a national championship for Florida State. But he was not even drafted in the National Football League. He would take his talents on and play NBA basketball, being drafted by the New York Knicks. This is going to be part 1 of the journey, the evolution, the perseverance, and the determination of the African-American quarterback. Part 2 is going to focus mainly on the evolution, and I'm going to start in 1994. And then I would come all the way up to now, leading up to this historical game in the Super Bowl 57, of the evolution of the African-American quarterback. Thank you all for tuning in. Again, I'm former NFL player Russell Copeland, played for the Buffalo Bills, Green Bay Packers, and Philadelphia Eagles. Thank you all for tuning in. Hit the like button and subscribe. Once again, thank you.